Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about a little book that I just finished reading the other day by Gavin Ortlund. It's called Humility, the Joy of Self-Forgetfulness. This was published by Crossway back in 2023. I had seen it, it had been out for a little bit. I love Gavin Ortlund's stuff. I watch pretty much all of his YouTube videos, and I've read a number of his books, and I have found both his academic and his more popular work to be very helpful. He's like Lewis to me in that he's someone who um, I often disagree with on particular questions. You know, there's different stances he takes that are different than the positions I would take on various questions. But I always find him worth listening to or reading because there's such a Christ-like spirit and such clear thinking in everything that he does. So that's always helpful and kind of stimulating. But in this book, I have nothing that I disagree with. This is a phenomenal little work on a very important subject, the subject of humility. So this is actually the first book in a new series that Crossway is doing. I don't know if they have put out any other books in the series yet, but it's called Growing Gospel Integrity. That's the name of the series. Michael Reeves is the series editor for this, and he talks in the kind of introduction about what they're trying to do, and he kind of roots this this whole series in Paul's words to the Philippians from Philippians chapter 1, verses 27 through 30. And Paul there calls on believers to live as citizens of heaven, to behave in a manner that's worthy of the gospel. And Paul points to four things that will look like in the life of the believer and in the life of a faithful church. To live with integrity, to live in a manner worthy of the gospel, to live as a citizen of heaven will look like living worthily, unitedly, courageously, and humbly. And so I guess they're going to have a book on each of those four marks, and they're starting with the last one, humility. And so this is the first book in that little series. This was just providential because I've been preaching through the book of Philippians. I had literally just preached Philippians 1, 27 through 30, which is sort of where they took the idea for this series from, and was going to be preaching on the first few verses of chapter 2, which is where Paul talks about unity and humility in the church. I had preached on unity and was getting ready to preach on humility, and I thought, hey, I think Gavin Ortlund has a little book on that. I should get a hold of that. And so I read most of this in the lead up to my sermon and then finished it off after preaching this last Sunday, and just found it so helpful. I referenced this book quite a bit in my sermon because what Gavin is trying to do in this book is to I would say, in a sense, kind of re-enchant us with humility, make humility not just something that we should have as Christians, but something we should want as Christians. And he presents humility as really being the pathway to joy. You can see in the subtitle kind of his idea, the joy of self-forgetfulness. One of the things that he talks about in the book, he draws heavily on Tim Keller and C.S. Lewis and Jonathan Edwards, a number of other thinkers as well, of course. But all of those thinkers get at this idea that humility is the opposite of pride. Pride is all about obsession with self, being oriented towards yourself, and that could look like either self-promotion, it could look like self-pity, but our natural default as fallen sinful people is to be obsessed with ourselves. We think about what I want, what I need, how I'm being mistreated, how I should be treated, whatever it is, and that is a killer to Christian obedience. The life of the Christian is not a life of pride and self-satisfaction and self-promotion and self-ambition. It's a life of self-sacrifice. It's a life of self-forgetfulness. But one of the things that I think Ortlund does a great job of drawing out, both from the scriptures and then from some of those other thinkers that I mentioned, Keller and Lewis and Edwards, is the way in which that self-sacrifice and self-forgetfulness is not only kind of the right thing to do, it's not just a duty, it's actually the pathway to delight. When we are focused on ourselves, this is the kind of paradox which Christianity brings us right into the depths of this. We think that the way to satisfaction is to focus on ourselves and get what we want, but that's not the way to fulfillment, because that's not what God is like, right? We're trying to if we're going to live in the world that God has made, we must be like God, and God is not a being who's fixated and focused on himself at the expense of others. We all owe our existence to the overflow of his love, to his creative character and his affection that he puts upon us. We serve a God who set heaven to the side to come down on earth and live among us, which is exactly what Paul talks about in Philippians 2 and Ortlund talks about as well. And so he's trying to help us see that the path of humility is at the heart of the Christian faith. It's really kind of the father of all the other virtues, or the mother of all the other virtues, in the same way that pride is the mother of every sin or vice. Humility is the mother of every virtue or act of obedience, because it's what it looks like to live like Jesus. And so he talks about why we misunderstand humility, some of the kind of false ideas or definitions that we have. And then he kind of breaks this little book up into two parts. So part one is cultivating personal humility. Part two is cultivating humility in our church life. So in that first part, he talks about how the gospel defines humility, going over a lot of the things that I've sort of summarized here already. He talks about how the gospel fuels humility. That's very important, because it's not just that Christ is giving us an example of what humility looks like, and then we, in our own strength, by our own resources, achieve that life. Again, that's just another kind of turning us back on ourselves. No, the whole point of humility is to say, I'm dependent. I need God. I need other people. And what we need to have humility is the gospel of Jesus Christ, and is the gift of Christ himself. And so he draws out, how does Christ's life and work, example and ministry, the indwelling of his spirit, the promises of the gospel, how do all of these things actually produce and fuel gospel humility in our lives? And then he ends that first part, cultivating personal humility, with a really helpful chapter called 10 Practices to Kill Pride. So again, this understanding of humility as the opposite and the enemy of pride. Killing pride is going to promote humility. And so he goes through, again, just 10 practices. Some are very simple, just to help us grow in this. So it's a very, very practical book. And then he moves from cultivating personal humility in the first 3 chapters to talking about cultivating humility in our church life in the last 3 chapters. So there's 6 chapters altogether. This book is like right at 100 pages, very short, very accessible. And in that second section where he's talking about cultivating humility in our church life, he looks at humility in leadership, humility among peers, and then humility towards leaders. So I'm a Reformed pastor in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. We hold to a confessional statement called the Westminster Standards. And if you're familiar with Westminster Standards, the Catechism sort of talks about, when it's talking about the 10 Commandments, the 5th commandment, to honor your father or mother, it shows how that's not just applying to our physical parents. It's talking about anyone who's in authority over us. And so it sort of walks through in a series of really excellent questions. How should you relate to people who are in authority over you? How should you relate to people who are, your peers at the same status as you? How should you relate to people who are under your authority? And that's kind of the pathway that Ortlund ends up following. I don't think he mentions the Westminster Catechism specifically on that line, but he's looking at how humility teaches us to interact with those under our authority, those over us in authority, and those along whom we serve as equals. And that's a very helpful book, because I think this is one of the things that I was reminded of in my study of humility for the sermon I preached this last Sunday. And that is that humility is a relational thing. It comes out when we interact with other people. So as we're interacting with others, whether it's in our family, roommate, classmates, co-workers, church members, either pride is going to come to the surface or humility is going to come to the surface. And so I like the fact that Ortlund doesn't just sort of keep it at this individual level of here's how you get humility on your own, because that's not really what humility looks like. It looks like living with other people in a way that, as Paul puts it in Philippians 2, you're counting others as being more significant than yourself. You're looking not only to your own interests, the things that impact and affect you, but you're looking to the interest of others. And so by taking that doctrine into the church, he allows us to kind of see how humility is interconnected with those different relationships. In doing that, he gets to warn against a number of dangers that have become so common in our culture. He speaks to leaders and warns against the danger of spiritual abuse or abuse of authority. There should be a humility that cultivates the culture of our congregations or institutions, leadership, whatever it might be. He also talks about to those under authority. There's a real, we live in an age that is rebelling against anything that smells of authority, anything that feels anti establishment is in. In many ways, the establishment now is anti establishment. And I'm not just talking about politics, although we see it there in politics as well, but there's a sort of natural bent to push against authority, to not want to be under authority at all. But humility is the opposite of that. It's the antidote to that. It's also the antidote to abuse of authority, right? So we see how, from every vantage point, no matter what the position, humility is what's called for. And of course, when you look at our culture, what we see is not the unity and humility that Paul calls us to in Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. It's division and pride that's all around us. So what that means is that we really need resources like this that reacquaint us with and help us to wrestle with humility personally and corporately as a church. But it also means that living with humility, speaking with humility, it's humbling, I can't say the word, speaking with humility is something that's very compelling and very attractive because we don't see it around us. And this is something, again, I think I see exemplified in the writings of C.S. Lewis, in the works of Gavin Ortlund, something that I hope by God's grace to grow in myself, to speak in a way that would be compelling and attractive to people, because it would be different, because it would look and feel and smell like Christ, which is, of course, what humility will draw us to ultimately is Christ-likeness. So this is a wonderful book. You could go through this with a youth group. You could go through this with a leadership team. You could read through it as a kind of devotional book. I think especially for leaders. I mean, as I think about identifying elders, deacons, young men who are thinking about ministry, I think this is a book I'm going to be using in those forums because while there are many qualifications and gifts that are required, at the heart of them all is humility. And if they have every other gift but they don't have humility, they should not be in leadership. That's the biblical standard. So as leaders, we should all be seeking to grow in humility and evaluating ourselves, our lives, our ministry according to the standard that the gospel holds us to. And this book is a great entry into that and summary of that. So I would highly, highly recommend this little book by Gavin Ortlund, Humility, the Joy of Self-Forgetfulness.